Hello, everybody, and welcome to the concurrent session on community-based solutions and food security. So food insecurity affects the whole community and some populations more than others. We realize that effective solutions to food security are often faced by those in the community base because the community and the community members know what they need and are better able to develop and implement appropriate and useful solutions. Today's panelists will share their knowledge to inform our understanding of and considerations and requirements for community-based solutions. Today, I'd like to welcome Amélie Neault, is the Administrative Coordinator at Atelier Social Innovation Workshop, an inclusive bilingual space for collaboration, training, knowledge sharing, and support for social innovation. Airin is the Program Director at Roots Community Food Centre in Thunder Bay. Amanda Wilson is an Assistant Professor in the School of Social Innovation at St. Paul University. Her areas of research include food movement and carceral food systems, governance and collective organising, and questions related to prefiguration and enacting a politics of possibility. Whew, that was a mouthful. And as you know, we've already just had a wonderful drumming and meditation session by Sherelle Anderson and Lana Purcell in the drumming meditation session. Sherelle is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation and is Program Director at Rise Up Indigenous Wellness Society. And Lana Purcell is a member of the Hackshaw First Nation and is the Executive Director with Rise Up Indigenous Wellness Society. So today, we'll start with the opportunity for each of the panelists to share a quick 1 to 2 minute summary about their thoughts on the topic before we proceed to some of the prepared questions. Each panelist will have the chance to answer, and to ensure we are respectful of time, I will ask you to move along if I find that time is getting tight in your response. Please don't hate me. And so I'd like to call on our first panelist to tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and some of your thoughts on the topic. And maybe we could start with Amélie Neault to get us started off for today.
Hi, hello everyone. So as Natalie mentioned, I'm the administrative coordinator at the Atelier. So just to give you a little bit of context, we are a nonprofit organization, and we're working in different areas. So not only in food-based or systems around food, but in different areas, but that are all linked to social innovation, so social transformation, social justice. And I'm personally interested in food systems, so I think that's one of the reasons why I was invited to participate today. So I'm just looking forward to discuss about the topic today, and just to brainstorm and hear what everyone else has to say about the topic, and just bring some maybe some ideas and some bring some ideas and some thoughts about the topic of today. So thank you very much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Amélie. Airin Stevens, would you be okay to get started on us next?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me here. I'm Airin. I am the program director at the new Roots Community Food Centre. We have been known as Roots to Harvest up until about 6 months ago. We are in Thunder Bay on the land of the Fort William First Nation people, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty folks. And we are an organization that grows food, serves food, cooks with food, uses food as a sense of, as a tool to build a sense of belonging and place, and to address issues within our community. When I'm thinking about this topic, around community-based solutions, I feel like as a not-for-profit, we're always in this reactionary mode of like, we need a solution to a problem that has come forward. So I think that happens, and we have some solutions that have worked for us that hopefully I'll be able to share today on this panel. But really, I had a conversation this morning, and it kind of grounded me in this. And often I feel that the community-based food solutions start with the individuals and with people changing their own assumptions and beliefs around need and want and what is good for people. And so I think I'd like to also bring that perspective to it. Like, what are the ways in which not-for-profits are responding in project advocacy, policy levels, but also how are we as each individuals every single day challenging our own assumptions and beliefs about how and what people need for food and belonging and all that. So that's what I hope to bring.
Brilliant. Thank you, Airin. And can I call on Sherelle and Lorna?
Yes, thank you. We are with the nonprofit Rise Up Indigenous Wellness. Food security is a big portion of what we do around holistic wellness and health, from direct supplying of food to communities to community kitchen type of food cooking programs to preservation. I really liked what Airin had to say about the connection of community and food, because a big part of our process is connecting cultural practices to food and our traditions of sharing what we have with everyone, and like maybe a little conversation around how that's been interrupted on some of the things. And also we look a lot at decolonizing the diet for from an Indigenous community perspective. So just really culturally sound practices to meeting people's food needs. So looking forward to connecting with some of the people here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Lorna. And Amanda, did we hear from you?
Sure. I mean, first off, it's so great to be on a panel with such wonderful folks doing great work in your communities. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm coming to you from unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And it might seem strange to have an academic as part of a panel entitled Community-Based Solutions to Food Security. But I think that research and collaboration with universities and academics can have an important role to play in both supporting and enabling responses to food insecurity, but also in supporting kind of that reflection and evaluation piece to ensure that the solutions we're collectively putting forward are actually helpful to achieving the goals, that we're working towards. And I think a lot of my research it's very collaborative, it's very community-based, and it's clear from that work and from work that I've done in nonprofits before I became a professor that I think fundamentally we have the solutions to food insecurity in hand. I think fundamentally we know how to end food insecurity, whether it's basic income, living wages, decommodification of, basic human needs, free, accessible, collective spaces for food provisioning, and anti-capitalism. I think writ large, we know what the solutions are. And so for me, I think the interesting challenges before us are really about what are like the tools and strategies and projects to help us get there. And so hopefully we'll be able to get into some of that in our conversation today.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing me. I'm hearing some themes come through already around challenging our own assumptions. And I think that's come through in our conference today already. But I'm also really interested to hear the conversation around the culture and practice of food and that being interrupted. I think already I'm starting to hear some areas of real interest, and we haven't even gotten to our questions yet. So our first question that I do want to pose to the panel is, who are we including or excluding in our definition of community and community-based food solutions? So that was, who are we including or excluding in our definitions of community and community-based solutions? If you don't mind, would we have to start the conversation with Airin? Would you be comfortable with starting off with our first response?
Yeah, and I think there's always an idea that we include folks and we're always excluding folks. So I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're not always aware of who we are excluding. And so I think including a diverse set of voices is always the intention of everyone, but not necessarily like it happens, right? And so to acknowledge that it happens and who we should include is just an opportunity for learning. In a recent project that we did around dignified food access in the North Slow and Thunder Bay, we looked at what was happening during COVID and when folks were accessing food in the food bank. And a lot of the stuff during COVID went really back many, many steps. And we're asking folks for registration and providing proof of need. And it just was going really, really far back. So we decided to come together and because we're hearing from community members that it was just really undignified. And so we decided to bring together a group of folks to talk about this need, and mostly organizations, who is doing what. And what we realized at the time is that so much of the community-based food solutions lives in the realm of just the food organizations, or organizations that are doing food, like the big capital F food, not food off the side of their desk. So we decided to just put a broad call out to who are the folks who are doing dignified work, and to come together to have a conversation. So we had Elevate, which is our local HIV Hep C supportive network in town. We had after school programs, we had cultural programs, but not necessarily the ones where their big thing was a food bank. We had one food bank, but that's it with that. We really wanted to hear who was doing the work. And I think that really opened our eyes around who is being included and who should be included, because we learned alongside folks in the most unusual and beautiful ways, you know, like they might not necessarily be doing food, but they know how to reach people in dignified ways. And so I think community-based food solutions need to be done in a dignified way. And so we spent the year afterwards just trying to like figure that out. Like, how do you do it? What does it smell like, feel like, taste like, sound like? How do you do advocacy within that? So yeah, I think that's just sort of like where we entered this last year of the conversation on. And so as an organization, we're starting to really broaden out. You know, one of our main partners is the Elizabeth Fry Society. And so they are, you know, they work with women who are at risk of or coming out of incarceration. And so they've become a really big partner with us. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm just going to add that interesting piece, because I think we all talk about like who's left in and who's left out, but really broaden your approach and broaden who you see as allies, partners, collaborators, conspirators, whoever it is super important.
Right. Thank you for that, Airin. Can I invite Sherelle and Lana to speak into this?
Hello. So with Rise Up, we're an Indigenous organization, and we focus on urban Indigenous people because they're the people who are removed from their home reserves or living away from their home reserves. So a lot of the they don't have access to maybe the same things that the community members are getting if they're living on reserve. So that's where our focus is with urban Indigenous population. So with our organization, I guess we're in a sense we're excluding non-Indigenous people, but it's also to do with the fact that with funding, when we apply for grants, we streamline ourselves usually with Indigenous grants. So that's the population that we're serving.
Yes, and that inclusive piece of the urban Indigenous people includes like a lot of what Airin said about like doing it in a dignified way that is not isolating or separating. We had a difficult history in our community years ago of the local food banks not supporting many Indigenous people because they felt like they could get the food elsewhere. So there's a background and a history that we're trying to overcome here too when it comes to like providing food security, but also in a non-traditional way, traditional Indigenous way maybe, but non-traditional food security way. Yeah. So that's sort of our including and excluding piece.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for speaking to that. Amélie, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, if I can just add a few words after what Airin and I'm sorry, I just forgot your names and I only see one on the screen, but I'm so sorry. Well, one thing that, I think is interesting is, the part of excluding and including based on, the type of your organization. I was giving a workshop yesterday about like diversity and inclusion, and this idea that we have a tendency to always like put things in a box, right? To like categorize what we do in order to get more funding, in order to like approach other people, in order to like, say we're like this type of organization and we're doing this and this. And I think that's really interesting because obviously none of us are living in silo and in like one, we're not going one way in one specific road, right? Like everything is like interconnected, and that's often why I say that I'm like interested in food systems, because we're gathering people from, you know, all over the place who are doing specific work in one area, but everything is sort of to get mixed up together. So I think that's very interesting. This, you know, notion of including or excluding some folks when we're talking about food insecurity, community-based solution. And yeah, so I think that's partly why I'm here today, because we're not like specifically focused on food solution per se, but we do have, you know, we're still part of, I guess, the community, and in order to try to change things up. So yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Amélie. Last voice on the question would be to Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything that everyone else just said. And I think really, to me, the most important thing is that we're asking the question, right? So that I think in some ways, inevitably, you know, anytime we do a project, there's going to be boundaries. And so we're going to be excluding and including people, sometimes for legitimate reasons and sometimes for problematic ones. But I think coming to that question of who we're including with a lot of intentionality and care. And so we're doing it in very thoughtful ways, right? So, you know, for example, you know, Lon and Sherelle talked about, well, we focus on urban Indigenous communities, and there's a lot of great reasons why you would do that, right? And so I don't think that's not a problematic exclusion. There's, you know, excellent reasons for that. But then I think there's other ways in which we exclude people from our communities that we don't think about, right? So I'm doing, you know, research right now on carceral food systems. So looking at intersections between food systems and prison systems. And so I think, you know, folks who are incarcerated are one of, you know, the most food insecure people in our communities, but we rarely think about people in prison as part of our community. And another project I'm involved in looking at food system governance through surveys and interviews, we've noticed that one big gap is labor. So that a lot of food systems organizations working on, you know, not just food security, but food systems in general, don't have a lot of active engagement with food and farm workers, right? And so that doesn't seem like it's an intentional thing, it's kind of an oversight. And so it's not, you know, we're not going to include everyone in our conceptions of community, but let's be mindful and intentional about who we are and who we aren't.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what I've also heard come through in that is that sometimes maybe some decisions don't feel like they're our own when we're talking about funding streams and having to really reach out for that and have to either focus on one area of work when really you could do other areas of work when talking about funding streams, kind of dictating where we get to work and kind of having those conversations for us sometimes. Our next question is, how do we avoid assuming what's needed in a community? How do we make sure that we're not the people making the decisions? So I'm going to ask if we can have Amélie start us off with this question. And again, it's how do we avoid assuming what's needed in the community?
Yeah, thank you. Interesting question. I think it's, I mean, I guess the obvious answer would be to, given the time frame and, you know, the availability and the resources that we have, is to go out in the community and invite people to talk about what, you know, what are the issues, or what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and or what sort of, you know, if we're like applying for a grant and, you know, we're trying to build a project. I think that's something that I have a tendency to do. It's like, if you're applying for a project and you're trying to, instead of like just working by yourself or, you know, among your peers and your team, is to go and, you know, just go and talk to other potential collaborators or people in the community who would be benefiting from whatever projects you're trying to build. So I think that's like probably like a basic 101 thing that we should all be sort of mindful when we're trying to build something. And also, like, given that, you know, we have like limited resources oftentimes. So yeah.
Thank you, Amélie. Amanda, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the answer to the question is in the question itself, right? How do we avoid assuming what's needed? Well, we don't obviously there are some assumptions we need to make, right? We can't be starting at zero every time we embark on a project or a program or a proposal. There are, some assumptions that I think we can, treat as facts, so we're not reinventing the wheel every time. But recognizing what factors are context dependent, I think, is really important. And so taking the time, I think, like Amélie was saying, to build relationships, right, to have those conversations. And I think a lot of those things can be structured into how we approach community work, right? So having enough time, I think so often nonprofits, feel like timelines and limitations are imposed, right? So there's like applications for grants, and then there's evaluations, and then reports, and all of these things feel outside of our control. But I think trying as much as possible to build in that time and building in long-term relationships, right? So it's not like, oh, we're doing a one-year project here and then we're going over here to this community, because that lead up time of building those relationships in a meaningful way takes a really long time. And then it feels super inefficient if every year you're doing a new project with a new community and have to build up that relationship and really give it the time it needs to co-develop something, right? So you're not making assumptions, you're actually in conversation with someone and doing it, lockstep together.
Oh yeah, thank you, Amanda. And Airin, I know you started us off with the idea of challenging assumptions. So how does this show up for you?
Yeah, and I really appreciate what Amélie and Amanda are saying. And I think, asking the questions and taking the time. I know working for a not-for-profit, we're like, really time bound and feel like there's limited time. And I thought maybe I would just share my screen for a second, because we came up with this campaign. So we realized like I'm just going to focus on one piece. It's like there are a lot of people who are making decisions about funding, who are having just passing comments, who also maybe are volunteering in different food places. And we really wanted to start to begin to challenge people's assumptions. And I just thought maybe just to add something else, I'm going to just share this visual that we created. So we created this campaign and it was about asking people to challenge their assumptions. This showed up in the local print media. It showed up in our bus shelters, on the back of our buses. So it's oriented differently. But the idea of like, it all begins like, so much of this begins with our own judgment and the, the bias that we carry with us all the time. And so we had these campaigns all over the city, the idea of like, this was like, we have a communications person who makes things really beautiful. But we hear a lot of these things like, why are those people not eating Canadian food? Or, so many of these, why do they have a cell phone and they're going to the food bank? And we really just wanted to stop those conversations and get people who, who are making the decisions, who are volunteering and who want to support maybe really good ways of accessing food to start at home. And so we did this campaign. I just thought it was super. I just thought it's like beautiful, and it was all over the place. And I just think, how do we assume what's needed in the community? Well, first we have to check our own assumptions, and then we just ask the questions and be okay with the answer. So I'm going to stop sharing that.
Thanks for sharing that, Airin, and maybe you could share those links or those resources with our team at the end of the conference to make them available broadly, and that'd be fantastic. And over to Lana and Shell.
Thank you. Wow, our minds are just turning, hearing everyone speak, and we're taking notes. So yeah, that would be great to have the resources shared. Because Airin kind of shifted our thoughts when we were thinking about this question, because much like Amanda said, as a small nonprofit, we're always looking at the constraints of time and building programs that fit within those parameters. But we really like to try to be traditional and include community and participants in all of the decision-making process. We don't want to just come on board and say, this is what we think you need. So we try to do, we recently did quite a big community engagement project that was just focused on what are other organizations doing? Where are we overlapping? What are our participants, our people wanting and needing? Like part of what came out of that was more social cultural connection. It wasn't just, they wanted the food, but they wanted to come together to prepare food. And they wanted to come together and participate in our ceremonies and culture with food as that piece too. So I think it didn't totally challenge our personal assumptions, but it did challenge the assumptions of some of our funders that that what we needed was X and Y, when we were able to have sort of backup by doing a community engagement project to say, no, this is what's happening. Yeah, we were able to provide sort of the more, I don't know, I want to say colonized approach, the more like structured approach to say, here's our reports, here's the answer, and then to decolonize by like saying, no, here's our cultural approach to providing food. But I hadn't thought about the sort of bigger picture of the assumptions in the community, like how Airin had put it.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, it just got my mind going, thinking about what we're assuming. And I like that we were able to do a community engagement, because then it's like, okay, how can we support each other in food security?
In our work as interagency.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think that's good.
Thank you for that. And I know you talked a little bit about culture as well. So I'm probably going to start with culture on my next question. And so what role does culture play in food security and in community-based solutions to food security? And maybe Sherelle and Lonnie, you can get a start with that.
Yeah. So when COVID hit, it really disrupted our whole system of gathering and being together as Indigenous people. And that was an opportunity for us, gathering is an opportunity for us to get together, share food, bond over it. And then when COVID hit, that disrupted everything. So really food is in our culture. Like if we, from the hunting and the fishing and the sharing, that's like at the core of Indigenous culture.
And so, yeah, there's a disruption of large gatherings, as Sherelle said. And then also, because we have a focus on urban Indigenous, the traditional ways of sharing food through gatherings or passing food along to other family members is also interrupted. We live somewhere that's somewhat rural areas, so we still have people who will fish or hunt for other families, but the larger areas that are close to us, it's interrupted because it's not feasible for the people. So then our cultural practice of sharing with everyone has been stunted really by that separation and by lack of passed on knowledge that would have occurred within cultural gatherings and within the family. So the old way of making sure everybody had enough to eat and making sure everyone was cared for is not the standard all the time in our communities.
Right. And I hear you talking more about that interruption of COVID in terms of the connectedness around food and community-based relations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, thanks.
I'm going to move over to, I think on next to my screen, I've got Airin.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that, the role that culture plays in kind of community-based food solutions is that, again, like we are often making assumptions about what people need, if that's either food or programs or timing of programs. And so, again, it's that thing about being curious and being curious about asking about how do people and what do people need, and partnering with folks who know this. And so we're a non-Indigenous organization that's not for profit. And so we are constantly working with our community partners and kind of doing everything together. And so we are in this relationship where we're unlearning and relearning together, but we're also in partnership as we are coming up with solutions and having these conversations. And so, it's about, the basic of who do we hire as at the organization, but then also who do we attract as participants or people who interact with us? And then how do we create a space of belonging? And so it's about, curiosity and compassion, but entering into all of the conversations, knowing that we all have unfiltered biases that we need to look at. And it might not always be the best, I might have a way where I want to figure out something, but it's okay to step back and let other folks try something out, because it's you learn always. So I don't know, that's just something else.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from that, Airin, is that like shared perspectives give you a fuller picture. So that burden of having to be the person with all the solutions or responses is not a way of working in a holistic approach. Amanda, would you be okay to contribute?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it short because I feel like y'all have already said really awesome things that I don't need to repeat or try to say in less eloquent ways. The one thing that I was thinking is that, you know, I think when we talk about like culture and particularly cultural foods, we think of it as sort of this like addition for folks that we see as other or diverse or marginalized, without recognizing that like culture exists regardless, right? So there is a dominant culture, right? There, like white people have culture, so there are cultural foods for white people. It's not just a thing that we ascribe to you know, folks that we see as racialized or indigenous or you know, international students. And so really thinking about, you know, culture is a part of everything we do, whether or not we acknowledge it or not, right? So it's not just this thing that we can add on and say like, oh yes, we should have cultural foods, you know, for the recent immigrants in our neighborhood. It's like, well, no, we should deconstruct what is the culture that we are perpetuating in our project, in our organization, and how open and diverse and inclusive is that culture.
Right. That was very eloquent, Amanda. Thank you. Amélie?
Yeah, similarly, I don't think I need to add much more on that topic, but I'll just say like an example that I witnessed when I was doing like a project. I was in Oslo in Norway for a couple of years, and they had like a great like urban agricultural farm. They had constructed a beautiful bread house, not bread house, but like a place where you're like baking bread. They called it the bread house in Norwegian. Anyway, and then they had like 3 different ovens in order to like welcome people from different, you know, background, from different cultural background. But once we got there, we realized that most people who were using the space and the urban farm was mostly, you know, the dominant culture, which, you know, were in that place were Norwegian, white Norwegian, who was using the place as a meeting place, as a gathering place, as an educational place. But they realized that they weren't really targeting people that, you know, the place was built for. So I think it's, again, like this, having a critical mind about what you're doing, what you're like putting out there in order to like, reach out more people. And are you doing it for the right purposes? Is it also maybe how you created a project at the beginning, and things like that, I think are all very important reminders for us all when we're like trying to find solution to be more inclusive, but also to like recognize that we have like a dominant culture and that we, you know, we don't necessarily always do it the right way the first time as well.
Sure. That willingness to make mistakes, Amélie, I think is important. And so we've got about 10 minutes before we move over to reviewing any questions in our chat. So I'm going to propose one more question to you guys. I'm going to ask you, how do power inequities impact our understanding of food security and the framing of community-based solutions? So how do power inequities impact our understanding of food security and the framing of community-based solutions? And Amanda, if I can ask you to start us off with your thoughts.
Sure, and I'll try to keep it snappy so we have time for questions. You know, I think power relations are like central and fundamental to both how we think about food security and insecurity, and also how we frame and construct solutions. I think in some ways I'm even skeptical about calling things solutions, because I think, you know, ultimately we can't solve the crisis of food security without addressing those much larger structural systemic issues, which require us, you know, to acknowledge and dismantle those power inequities. And that's not something that we're necessarily going to be able to do, you know, in the short term with an individual project. But I think it's really about building in that lens and that commitment to challenging those relationships within our daily work, right? I think until we do that, really all we're doing is we're mitigating, we're minimizing, and we're kind of building resilience, right? Because I think ultimately food security is a question of power, right? It's a question of who gets to make decisions about our food system. It's about the dominance of, you know, capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy in our food system. And all of those feel like really big, hard things, but I think, we can start just by asking questions about, who gets to make decisions about the nature of our food system, who disproportionately bears the harm in our food system and who disproportionately benefits, right? That food insecurity is not just sort of this benevolent, unfortunate byproduct of individual circumstance, right? That it's built in to the way that we have decided to structure our food system. And there are folks who are accountable to that, and we should build in that analysis and that commitment into our work.
Thank you, Amanda. Again, that was very concise. Thank you. Amélie, would you care to add?
I don't have much more to add. I think Amanda said it pretty neatly. To be honest, I don't really see how, at a community level, I mean, we have like, as Amanda said, we have like Band-Aid solutions, and we have like things that we can build for like, short-term, medium, long-term for our community. But at the core of it, it's also like a systemic approach that we have to take in order to change so many other things in order to, reduce food insecurity, and also to address that issue for, people who are more vulnerable in our society. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amélie. Airin.
I'm just going to add on to it, because I think Amanda said it perfectly. Like, there is always this power imbalance, and I don't think we can ever, when someone has food and someone needs food and we decide what they need or give it to them, there's always this power imbalance. It always feels gross to me. Like, I know people feel good that they're giving food, but to me, it just always feels gross and uncomfortable. I think the piece that maybe I'll add onto it, because I think Amanda said it way better than I would ever be able to say it, is that it is a both and situation. Like, people are working towards, creating food access in their communities in a dignified way, and that can happen. And at the same time, people need to be doing advocacy. And that's even if it's off the side of your desk, there is individual level advocacy, there is community level, there is provincial, regional, provincial, national. It's not just enough to say, here is this meal. It is using your voice and talking to your neighbors, or using your voice and writing something for the paper, or using your voice and, working with your local social planning council on their living wage campaign. Like, it's a both and for folks who are doing work in food. And so I think it has to happen that way. So I just thought I would add that.
Very motivating, Airin. Definitely, for sure. And over to Lana and Sherelle.
Thank you. And again, we feel the same. It's been said very clearly. It just a recent example came to mind several days ago. And it's like a tent encampment of there's a good chunk of Indigenous people that were on an area for since before COVID, that the city just recently forcefully removed. And we had centralized food support because there wasn't enough food support for the families that were there. So the power of the city deciding that they needed to be dispersed them throughout the community, but decentralized our support. Like, we had volunteers, and there was people that were available that came on at certain times to feed them. So that power structure really made it much more difficult now. Now we're like brainstorming new ways of how to get to ground level, street level, and support our people that are hungry and in need. So it's just so desperately it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's hard now, because it's like, who are we missing? Like if they don't make it there in time, and where are they? So it's just, how do we support that? Like, when the city comes in and does that, when they've been there for 3 years or so, like, and really they're harmless. It's like, that's where they've set up, and
yeah, difficult.
Yeah,
I can definitely hear that. And I think what's resonating with me, I think if you attended a session with Paul Taylor today, he talked about how food is a commodity, and so there's inherent found inherent power structures in that when food is treated as a commodity. So what other ways can you look at food to bring it back to more of a cultural power? And then also really focusing on those relationships that I heard Lana and Sherelle talk about, is that when we're talking about food and relationship and how it really does bring people together in community. It's such a strength. And I think when you have it as a commodity, it can really be more siloed and lead people to be competitive and not engaged. And then moves you away from being a community-based or a community-focused people and into more of a chasing this commodity that you need to survive, basically. So that brings us to the end of our questions, but I'm going to be a little bit cheeky. I'm going to take 1 or 1.5 more minutes, and I'm going to ask you in 1 or 2 sentences or less, what concrete steps would you suggest that we take in our community to build food security? What concrete steps would you suggest that you would take in our community to build food security? And 1 to 2 lines, and I'm going to rapid fire it over to Amélie.
I would say, just talk to people and reach out to people in your community to understand their needs, their concerns. Yeah.
Excellent. Amanda.
But I'm not going to give a specific example, but I want to echo something that Airin said about both and, that I think we often think about like frontline community work is one thing, and then more sort of like political organizing policy work is over here, and then we can do one or the other. But I actually think we can do both, right? Like we can have a community garden and talk about basic income, and we can go to the farmers market and talk about labor rights, and we can talk about support for migrant workers. Like I think we can do community work in a way that is transformative. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Perfect. Thank you, Airin. Both and. Sorry, Amanda. Over to Airin.
Sorry, my screen froze. I don't know what happened.
No problem. We can still hear you.
Okay, you can. What was the 1 to 2 sentences?
What concrete steps could we take in our communities to build food security? I'll let you have a think on it for a minute, and okay. I'll pass it on over to Lana and Sherelle, and we'll come back. Just let you have a think of it.
We're coming at it from an Indigenous perspective. So we would say engage the Indigenous communities and participants in the questions and the consultations, and also doing an engagement series that looks for where do we overlap? How can we support one another in our work?
Thank you, Lana. And back to Airin.
A concrete step, I don't think it's necessarily just for food security. I think it's for everything. It's like to ask the courageous questions and have those courageous conversations with people to challenge assumptions. I think the, stuff that starts off as these people need, it's like, okay, well, really, is that what they need? And where's that coming from? I think asking courageous questions and being willing to be in that bit of discomfort, because we all need a bit of discomfort to move forward in all of our relations. And so I think that ask the courageous questions, challenge our assumptions.
Excellent. Thank you, Airin. Thank you for that. And thank you all for your perspective and your input on such a engaging topic as well. I'm going to pass it over to Lauren over in our chat to see if there's any questions that we'd like to pose to the panel.
The chat has been very interesting throughout this conversation. Actually, there's been a lot of really good discussions happening in the chat as we're listening to the panelists talking. So I'm going to take a page out of Natalie's book and be a bit cheeky. I'm going to not ask the questions in order. So I'm going to splice together 2 questions from 2 people. So Peggy asked, how do you include people that are elderly or living alone? And then related to that question, Margaret addressed Peggy and said, or rather than finding ways to feed elderly people at home, is there a way to get them out to food centers? Greeters help people learn about food cooking, etc. So 2 questions spliced together for the panelists.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And I see a hand up go from Lana and Sherelle right away. So let's move over to Lana and Michelle.
Well, first, I think we were thinking about removing like transportation barriers. Are there people who can take elders or elderly people to a central location so that they can have a luncheon together once a week. We work with a local band here, and they have an elders luncheon, I think every Tuesday, and they, I don't know, 20 or so come there, and they make them a meal and they just share.
And bring home food. So it's like a cultural, social connection. It just requires a bit more transportation and things, but it definitely gets some people who are feeling lonely together and actually eating, some people that aren't eating at all sometimes. Yeah, so that's how it looks in our community.
That's great. Thank you so much. Would anyone else on the panel like to respond?
Maybe I'll just jump in. I think at the beginning of COVID, we really only have one daily meal provider up here in Thunder Bay, like a food program, and they do like, you know, close to like 900 and 1,000 meals a day. And so, but they approached us to say, we have so many like single seniors living at home. The tea and toast crowd, they called it, of folks who are needing food that works with folks who are living alone and maybe have like can't eat a hard carrot or an apple or have different health considerations, and they approached us. And so we started working with them to figure out like, how is it that we can support them? And so since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been doing bags once a week that are curated, and the seniors give lots of input. We include recipes for them with all of the ingredients so that they can make it, even if they just have a hot plate, like they're pretty simple recipes. And again, that's something that the seniors and elders have asked for. And so we've been doing that for about 3 years, and that's sort of moving into and like 150 bags a week we do, but then that's moving into our food access programs, and we are having community meals, and we're going to have them targeted. So they are going to be with seniors. And so we partnered with the different organizations that are working with senior support groups, as well as with our Indigenous Friendship Center that are doing meals for elders. And so we are going to be doing traditional meals and seniors meals that also bring in other services that can support those community members. So again, it's by building relationships and being in partnership with other agencies, you begin to learn where the need is. And so we start to work towards that need. We started as a youth organization working with tough teenagers. Like that's where we feel the most comfortable. So this is a huge learning for us. Working with seniors, like maybe is similar and also is like totally different. And so we're also, none of us are skilled to work in that area, but we're having to learn and be in a place of not knowing as much, but still being able to engage in that way, right? Being able to be humble about what we know and what we don't know and how we can support and take the lead from people who know. So.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Airin. Any more questions in the chat, Lauren? We might have time for one more.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to ask is a question I believe from Lubna. I copied and pasted it. So can edible weed, not marijuana, but flowers versus weeds, can edible weed contribute to food security in Ottawa? Purcell, as an example, is considered a weed here in Canada. I am originally from Africa. In Africa, the Middle East, and some parts of South Asia, purslane is an edible, tasty, and superfood. So is there space for maybe non-traditional foods that are considered weeds to be part of food security in Ottawa?
Thank you for that. Amanda, I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I was going to jump in. I mean, I think in some senses, yes, absolutely, right? And I think that goes back to our questions about like, how does culture play a role in food security? That what someone thinks of as a weed, right, is like a really interesting flavor to someone else. So I think absolutely thinking more, being much more open-minded about what we think of as food, right? And not just like the very typical, like, you know, cans of Chef Boyardee and food banks or whatever. I think the one like caution I would add to that is that, you know, we know that fundamentally food insecurity is not about a lack of food, right? That there exists like an incredible bounty of food. And the question is about, you affordability and access in that more structural way. And so I think we sometimes have similarly difficult conversations around food waste. And it's like, oh, if we could just take the food waste and put it in the food banks, we would solve food insecurity, right? And we know that it's obviously much more complicated than that. And it's not that like there isn't physically food in the world, right? It's the question of like power and distribution and affordability. So purslane, yes, awesome. Do I think that edible weeds will solve the food insecurity crisis? Absolutely not. Can it add a great complement and make us more diverse and inclusive in our approach? For sure.
So what I'm going to ask you to do is from the notes you took in your breakout session, if you could pop them into the chat there. And we're going to have a little sharing of what's showing up in the chat. And what's coming through is that building relationships is key. It's kind of an area of real interest. And I know the panel session have been talking about what those relationships would look like as well. So just in sharing information and sharing knowledge is really strong. We're looking at one component of ongoing work facilitated with Just Food in relation to food sovereignty, edible landscapes across Algonquin and Ottawa, community gardens, and then for backyard chickens, food forests. So I'm going to change up a little bit. And I'm going to say to our panelists, maybe if I can ask you, what's your key takeaway today? What would your reflection of that be? And maybe we'll start with Airin.
I think it's so great to see people in different parts on this continent engaging in food in different ways. And so I think that is always something that I take from this. And so, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Airin. Falana and Sherelle, what would your key takeaways be?
That idea of focusing on dignity in the work we're doing, and like incorporating also a different viewpoint on culture. Like that was something else that we heard, that we often think of culture as like our culture, like Indigenous culture, but looking at culture more holistically as well, and incorporating dignity in the work that we're doing, what questions, how to question ourselves and be curious.
Oh, fantastic. And Amélie.
Yeah, I would say that's something that I've been saying over for the last couple of months, but often I come from like a background of working for a better food system, and the work that I'm doing at the atelier right now is, not remotely close to anything that has to do with food, but there are so many parallels today that I've seen about, being more inclusive, and also just reaching out to other organizations that are not, in your field of work specifically. I think that's like my key takeaway, that, I've been able to like come here today, but not, working directly with food insecurity issues. But I think we can all learn from each other, and based, on the skills, competencies, assets that we have, and just build a stronger community, but also just a stronger, just a stronger community in general. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I'll give one last look into the chat and ask Lauren if there's anything to bring forward from our observations.
Yeah, I have a comment from Joseanne from Sandy Hill. So a reflection on meeting people where they are at, acknowledging that ongoing housing crisis, opioid crisis, pandemic times, et cetera, there is a substantial percentage of the population that is operating in survival mode. How best to serve these people in the moment when the concern is getting through the day versus long-term goals, re food access. And there's one more comment in the chat, if I have time to share quickly, from Peggy. So please think about the elderly people living by themselves with health issues. It seems that people directing decisions are young and have no lived experience. There needs to be more listening to the elderly and those who stay at home.
I do want to give another final thank you to our panelists today and our participants. The engagement of discussion has been really rich. And I think what we're looking at is when we're asking what community-based solutions are, we're looking at solutions or opportunities, and not necessarily one specific silver bullet approach. So thank you for sharing your perspectives, and thank you for driving this conversation today to get us all thinking about how we can contribute to our own communities as a takeaway. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.